Please welcome former White House Press Secretary and Special Assistant to President Johnson, distinguished journalist Bill Moyers.
Thank you, Nina. So when Mark Harpnegrove called to ask me on behalf of the foundation if I would pay tribute tonight to Justice Ginsburg, he had no way of knowing that the pump had been primed. 2 weeks from now, I will interview the Justice when she receives the Judith Davidson Moyers Spirit of Woman Award from Union Theological Seminary in New York, the oldest independent ecumenical seminary in the country, from whose board Judith recently retired. You never know at my age when the next interview you do will be the last. So in preparation for this interview, I began months ago to steep myself in the lore and legacy of Kiki Ginsburg. So nicknamed, I learned, because as an infant in Brooklyn, she earned a reputation for vigorous kicking. She later perfected that talent as a flaming feminist advocate. And she went on, as everyone here knows, to become one of our most influential figures of constitutional interpretation in our history. Notwithstanding the irony that the founding fathers excluded her from the Constitution, and not merely because she was from Flatbush. Wanted to be thoroughly prepared for this, I began scouring the literature, beginning with the biography Ruth Bader Ginsburg, A Life by Jane DeHart, then moving on to the New York Times bestseller, My Own Words, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, with legal scholars Mary Hartnett and Wendy Williams. Earlier this month, I gave up several nights of sleep to read the fascinating new book, Conversations with RBG, on life, love, liberty, and the law. Based on a 20-year friendship and running conversation between the justice and the legal journalist and scholar Jeffrey Rosen, who's also president of the National Constitution Center. I read all of Nina Totenberg's interviews, including the 31 she's done already this year. And I have, of course, reviewed a score of Justice Ginsburg's notable briefs, both affirming and dissenting. And in the next 2 weeks, I expect to gain access to all of the trash collected behind her house by the Federalist Society. But a funny thing happened in the course of my preparation. I found myself literally unaware of this event. I found myself marking at the bottom of the briefs, in the margins of the books, on Nina's interviews, the initials I scribbled, LBJ/RBG. Sometimes it was just the opposite, RBG, LBJ. Each, for me, came spontaneously as a point of convergence, an aha moment, a connection between Lyndon Johnson's presidency and Ruth Bader Ginsburg's opinions and arguments before and on the court. It was amazing, the common interests, the comparable values, the kinship of convictions. They were, of course, of different generations, born 25 years apart. RBG made her first oral argument before the Supreme Court as an advocate just 5 days before Lyndon Johnson died at his ranch in Texas. It's unlikely, as an old and young adult, they ever met. And yet, in so many ways, they wove similar patterns in the tapestry of democracy. One through politics, the other through the law. Now, when Mark called me to ask me to do this tonight, I didn't tell him that I'd done all this research already, but I did tell him that because I had been looking at some of her briefs, I had a story to tell him, and I wouldn't tell it tonight. This is not exactly the speech I intended to give, but everybody else has said the brilliant things I wanted to say anyway. But I told Mark this story, but I said I wouldn't tell it tonight. I told him of an event. It had been inspired by the brief that Justice Ginsburg wrote on the famous Voting Rights Act when in 2013, the 5 conservative members of the court declared unconstitutional the key provision striking down preclearance, as we heard earlier. What I told Mark is that late on an evening in June of 1964, I remember it so well because I was a few days before my 30th birthday. Before leaving the White House to go home, I delivered the president's night reading to his bedroom in the mansion. As I walked in, he was getting a massage. 10 o'clock it was at night. 10 o'clock news on WTOP was on. He was lying on his stomach. His chin rested on the fingers of his hands, but with one hand he shushed me as I entered the room. Shh, he said. He was looking up at the television screen on the other side of the bedroom, and there was, I think it was Roger Mudd, delivering an update from the steps of the Capitol on the filibuster that the Dixiecrats were waging with fierce intensity to try to preserve segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. They were filibustering the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and they were determined to kill it by speech. They were desperate. And the president was getting this update on the latest development on this June day. It went on for 60 days, the filibuster. Right after that report, a filmed statement by Martin Luther King came on from some church somewhere in the country. And the president is listening. Shh, he says. I just want to leave the pile of night reading and go home. He says, shh, wait. He says, he's quite a preacher, isn't he? I said, yes, sir, he is. I just today read one of his very terrific speeches, the baccalaureate he had given at Wesleyan University a few weeks earlier at the end of May. What did he say? The president asked me. He said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. He said that, the president said. He said that. Then he motioned me over to the massage table, asked me to lean down, and I did. And he said, not necessarily. It's not inevitable. It ain't going to happen. And he said ain't, I apologize, but he said ain't, unless we push. Because he said someone on the other side is always pushing back on the arc to reverse its course. Now he said, you get King on the phone. Tell him he's got to get up there to the Hill and tell all our friends in the Senate we got to shut off that goddamn filibuster and call the vote. Do you hear? I heard. I didn't call King on the way home. I called Hubert Humphrey. Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota was managing the floor fight of the Civil Rights Act. and he was in regular contact with Martin Luther King and his lieutenants. I don't know if he reached King, but I do know that on July the 2nd, the arc of history landed at the point on his desk when his pen touched the parchment of the Civil Rights Act that became the law of the land. As I say, I told Mark this story, but I wasn't going to repeat it tonight because he duly gave me 5 minutes for this talk, and he said Larry Temple and the board would fire him if Moyers went overtime. So start packing. What's this got to do with Ruth Bader Ginsburg anyway? She was only 33 when we passed the Civil Rights Act, 34 when a year later we passed the Voting Rights Act, just beginning her long and illustrious career. And of course, it took the course of gender, women's issues, and ours had taken the course of civil rights, but they all grew out of the same womb of human rights. So I was going to honor Mark's injunction and save his job. Until today, I changed my mind. This morning, Judith and I went over to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We walked past the exhibits, panel after panel. I'm sure most of you have been. If you haven't, go. Slavery's horrors, the reign of terror, the courage revealed by those who resisted, and the political betrayal by the first Johnson White House and by the Supreme Court that began to back away and back against and bend back the arc of history on issues of equality. We were walking there, and I was thinking about the arc of history and what the president said. You push it, they push back. You push it, they push back. We're in the pushback era now, the third great backlash to the struggle for human rights for blacks and women. And I remembered that line in Justice Ginsburg's incredible, scathing dissent of the 5 conservative members of the court who just gutted the Voting Rights Act 48 years after it had been passed and after it had been renewed under the 2 Bushes and Ford and a 4th time. And I stood there for a moment, sat there for a moment, and I thought of the glorious symmetry that we would sense in this room tonight when the family and friends of the second President Johnson and a living Supreme Court justice still pushing the arc forward. And I thought I had to tell you that story. The family and friends of one honoring the career and genius of a living Supreme Court justice who put her lean but mighty muscles on that arc as a young legal advocate and has kept pushing ever since. So there are scores of LBJ, RBG in the margins of the material I've been reading and underlining for that interview at your event, Judith. For example, Justice Ginsburg once defined affirmative action as endeavors to make the equality ideal more aspirational I think she said that in Fisher versus the University of Texas when she said, if a University of Texas wants to have a modest affirmative action program, I think that's great. It's their business. I thought when I read that in the brief I was underlining of what President Johnson said at Howard University in 1965 in one of his most controversial speeches. Quote, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say to him, you're free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you've been completely fair. It is not just enough to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens, men and women, black and white, must have the ability to walk through those gates. And this is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights." That was said 54 years ago. For both the justice and the president, equality became a battle of stereotypes and unconscious bias built into the systems and institutions, into, yes, law and tradition. She took on the case, as I think Nina was referring to, of Stephen Weisenfeld, whose wife died in childbirth. Stephen vowed he would work only part-time until his son was in school full-time. So he applied, though this is not the Idaho case. He applied for the Social Security benefits that he thought were available when a wage earner dies and leaves a child in the care of the surviving parent. But he was told by Social Security, "Mr. Wiesenfeld, that benefit is a mother's benefit, and you are not a mother." As his advocate, RBG won a unanimous decision from the Supreme Court that put an end not only to the discrimination, but to the stereotype. LBJ, too, battled not in arenas of abstract ideas, but for real life people. Human beings with names, feelings, and needs. The people, as James Taylor sang about tonight, who are right in front of you. In 1964, as I was saying, reactionaries in Congress, many of them his old colleagues, if not his old friends, tried to exempt private business from the proposed Civil Rights Act, requiring an end to discrimination by any business making a profit from serving the public. The president wouldn't budge. I heard him time and again argue that when Helen and Gene Williams, a couple on his staff, drove across the South from Washington to Austin and back, they were more likely to find a motel with a room for a dog than one with a bed for people of color. But I thought at the museum today, if they'd gone through Humboldt, Tennessee, they would have found a red sign there that said, Booker T Motel, everyone welcome. But they were few and far between. For her part, Justice Ginsburg still writes and talks about the individual men and women whose lives have changed because the law was changed. Gwendolyn Hunt, who insisted a trial by her peers meant women on the jury. Sally Reed, who objected to that Idaho law that gave men preference over women in managing the estate. And Lilly Ledbetter, cheated by a huge corporation out of the wages she was due, who only wanted to be paid the same as men doing the same kind of work. Both the politician and the justice made America more just and made it more embracive. That's her term. She loves the term embracive. Embracive of the abandoned, embracive of the left out, and embracive of those left behind. Women, former slaves, Native Americans, embraced not grudgingly, but with open arms, becoming we the people thanks to progressive politics, constitutional amendments, and judicial interpretations. In doing this research, I came across a video of the Justice's last appearance as students at George Washington University. She told them that America's greatness came from welcoming all, from the idea that we are many, but we are one. And when I went home that evening, I looked on YouTube and found President Johnson sitting at the base of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, Lower Manhattan behind him in one frame, and out of the other frame, Ellis Island. And what was he doing? Signing the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Signing it. And saying to everyone gathered there, "Our beautiful America is because we have opened our doors to so many, bringing new sources of ideas and culture." It really is, isn't it, when we put everything else aside? It really is about liberty and justice for all. Otherwise, democracy is a lie. But it's not a lie. Even as adherents of social Darwinism and sociopathic authoritarianism are trying to shut it off, finish it down, turn the very idea of one person, one vote into a winner-take-all society. But in different times and different ways, RBG and LBJ were on the right side of the oldest story in America, driven home by the exhibit at the museum today. The struggle to determine whether we, the people, are indeed a metaphysical reality, one nation, one indivisible, or merely an economic casino masquerading as piety and manipulated by the powerful and the privileged to serve their advantage at the expense of others. It is liberty and justice for all, or we're living a lie, and we're not living a lie.